Hello, this is Christopher from Defeat Modernism, and welcome to The Rulers of Russia by Father Denis Fahey. I thought this would be an excellent subject to cover, given what's going on in the world, as all of you know. This was written back in the late 1930s, 1940, with the first edition coming out in 1938, and then the American edition in 1940. There have been several newer editions as well. I'm going to be reading from the 1940 edition, and for those of you who may not be familiar with Father Fahey, he was a Holy Ghost father. He was born in County Tipperary, Ireland, on July 3rd, 1883. He was educated by the Holy Ghost Fathers, which led to his priestly vocation, and at the age of 17, he entered the novitiate of the Holy Ghost Fathers near Paris. He made his religious profession on February 2nd, 1907, and was ordained to the priesthood in Rome on September 24th, 1910. He was ordained by Cardinal Respighi at St. John Lateran. He passed away January 21st, 1954. He is well known for his works on the social kingship of Christ. One of his famous quotes had to do with that subject. He is known for saying, "The world must conform to our divine Lord, not he to it." He was outspoken against communism, Freemasonry, and Talmudic Judaism. So obviously he is considered a quote-unquote anti-Semite, and that is certainly a badge of honor. Now, in this particular video, I'm going to be covering his work entitled The Rulers of Russia, and this is going to give an excellent history lesson as to what happened to that country and what were the JudeoMasonic forces behind it. There's going to be a lot of shocking information here, a lot of history that maybe most of you don't know. A lot of traditionalists, you will know this, but there's a good amount of people that just are not aware of what really happened in Russia and who were the forces behind it and are behind it to this day. So on the screen now, I'll put some of his works, so certainly consider reading some of his books. I will put a link to the actual free download of the PDF file of this book if you want to read along that way, or if you want to just read it on your own. I will try to stick to the book as much as possible. There might be sections where I will cut in and maybe add some commentary or add some additional quotes from other priests or publications if it makes sense, just to bring some more information, modern-day information to it. And some other books I would suggest reading would be Secret Societies and the Kingship of Christ that he authored, and then also Money Manipulation and the Social Order. I may consider doing videos on that in the future as well. But from there, let's get into this great work. For those of you who are listening on the podcast, what I have on the screen now is just the cover page of the book itself. It says The Rulers of Russia, and has a quote there from Pope Pius XI from his encyclical letter Divini Redemptoris on atheistic communism. And the quote says, "For them, the peoples of the Soviet Union, we cherish the warmest paternal affection. We are well aware that not a few of them groan beneath the yoke imposed on them by men who, in very large part, are strangers to the real interests of the country. We recognize that many others were deceived by fallacious hopes. We blame only the system with its authors and abettors, who considered Russia the best prepared field for experimenting with a plan elaborated years ago, and who, from there continue to spread it from one end of the world to the other," end quote. And it's just important to point out there that Pius XI is explaining that the people who are responsible for this Russian Revolution were not, in fact, from Russia. And Father Fahey will get into that in much more detail. On that cover page, as you can see on the left-hand side, it says, "Listen to Father Coughlin's broadcasts." I'm sure many of you know Father Coughlin. He was what was termed a so-called controversial speaker. He had a radio show, was very anti-communist, anti-atheistic Jewish communism, and therefore he was removed from the air because of that. I am considering making videos on his broadcasts. I'm not sure if I will put it on YouTube. I may just put it on my podcast channel and Odyssey. So just keep an eye open for that. I may do that in the near future. So let's now get to the next page. You can see here that this is the 1940 edition, written by Father Denis Fahey, Holy Ghost Missionary College in Kimmage, Dublin. He was professor of philosophy and church history there. And now on this next page, you can see the Nihil Obstat and the Imprimatur, dated November 15th, 1939. And the reason why I'm pointing that out is it just shows it has the approval of the bishop, and that what's in this book is in line with the teachings of the church and what was taking place historically, politically, during that period of time. So now I'm going to read the foreword, and the information in the foreword is probably going to knock some people off their chair, because a lot of this is hidden, and you're going to be probably unbelievably shocked. But remember, this is being written, or was written, 1938, with this edition in 1940. So this was right at the beginning of World War II. And remember, in 1932 to 1933, in Ukraine, which was then run by the Soviet Union, which Father Fahey is discussing in this book, 1932 to 1933, there were some 10 million white Ukrainian Orthodox Christians massacred, genocide, in what was called the Holodomor. I'm going to bring that up a little bit later, but just remember those years and those dates. There's an important reason why I'm stressing this. And please forgive me for mispronouncing some of these words. Some of these last names are difficult to pronounce. So just a heads up on that one. So here we go. Forward to the third edition. In his well-known book, Geneviève contre la Pax, pages 83 to 92, Count de Saint-Olier, former ambassador of France at Madrid and London, gives an interesting account of a quote-unquote lecture on the mission of Israel amongst the nations by a Jewish banker of New York. The quote-unquote lecture was quote-unquote delivered at an international dinner at Budapest in 1919, only a few days after the collapse of the Judeo-Bolshevist domination of Bela Kun over Catholic Hungary. The Count explains, by way of introduction, that a number of Jewish revolutionaries who had been expelled from Hungary had returned there in American uniforms after the armistice, and that their reports guided President Wilson in his attitude towards all that concerned the interests of Israel. This explains in particular, adds the Count, the president's scandalous partiality towards the Bolsheviks. In reply to the question how it was possible for high finance to favor Bolshevism, which is hostile to property, movable and immovable, the Jewish banker began by explaining that those who are astonished at the alliance between Israel and the Soviets forget that the Jewish nation is the most intensely national of all peoples, and that Marxism is simply one of the weapons of Jewish nationalism. Capitalism, he added, is equally sacred to Israel, which makes use of both Bolshevism and capitalism to remold the world for its ends. The process of renovation of the world is thus carried on from above by Jewish control of the riches of the world, and from below by Jewish guidance of revolution. Israel has a divine mission. In fact, Israel becomes its own Messiah, is God. Israel is purifying the idea of God and at the same time preparing the way for the definitive triumph of the chosen race. Thus the banker concluded, Jewish power of organization is manifested at one and the same time by Bolshevism with its delirium of destruction, and by the League of Nations in the sphere of reconstruction. The quote-unquote lecture given by this Jewish banker came back to my mind when I learned that the information given in the document quoted by me briefly on page 27 of this pamphlet and at length on pages 88 to 91 of The Mystical Body of Christ in the Modern World had been called in question in New York. It occurred to me that he might be asked to repeat the quote-unquote lecture in public and thus enlighten my critics far more effectively than I could hope to do. Accordingly, I asked a well-known authority on JudeoMasonic subversive activities, M.L. de Ponsens, to find out from the Count de Saint-Aulaire if he had taken note of the name of the banker. The Count courteously replied that he had not done so, but he added that the quote-unquote lecture being the expression of the mentality not of an individual, but of a group. Every Jewish banker of New York would have said exactly the same in a moment of sincerity. And that letter was dated March 19th, 1939. So just to add some commentary here, because here he's going back to 1919. The Jewish Bolshevists took over Catholic Hungary, imprisoned those people, massacred those people. You see the President of the United States at that time, President Wilson, being pro-Israel. Can you even think of one president that was not pro-Israel? I think JFK was actually trying to prevent Israel from getting nuclear weapons, if my memory serves me correctly. And there was some thought that it was the Mossad who actually put the hit on him because of that, because the relations between the United States and Israel did a 180 after his assassination, as did many other things. So just another thing to kind of ponder. But we can see he's explaining that capitalism and Marxism or communism, socialism, however you want to term it, they're two sides of the same coin. So they're getting to the same end, and we're watching that real time now. We're watching what took them decades and decades, over a century to put into place, slowly bleed out the nations, slowly bleed out the United States. Now we're in that endgame period, and this book is really going to be a fascinating read, I think, for many of you, because of the benefit of hindsight and what we're experiencing now. But I digress. Let's get to this next part of the foreword. This section is titled Proximate Preparations of the Russian Revolution. I intend to examine the whole question at length in a book upon which I am engaged, The Mystical Body of Christ and the Organization of Society. For the moment, I will content myself with quoting a few documents that are not as well known as they ought to be. One is a secret report received by the Imperial Russian General Headquarters from one of its agents in New York. This report, dated February 15th, 1916, was made known to the world by the Russian writer Boris Brasol in his book, The World at the Crossroads. It runs in part as follows, quote, "The Russian Revolutionary Party of America has evidently resumed its activities. As a consequence of it, monumentous developments are expected to follow. The first confidential meeting, which marked the beginning of a new era of violence, took place on Monday evening, February 14th, 1916, in the east side of New York City. It was attended by 62 delegates, 50 of whom were quote-unquote veterans of the Revolution of 1905, the rest being newly admitted members. Among the delegates were a large percentage of Jews, most of them belonging to the intellectual class as doctors, publicists, etc., but also some professional revolutionists. The proceedings of this first meeting were almost entirely devoted to the discussion of finding ways and means to start a great revolution in Russia as the, quote, most favorable moment, for it is close at hand, end quote. It was revealed that secret reports had just reached the party from Russia, describing the situation as favorable, when all arrangements for an immediate outbreak were completed. The only serious problem was the financial question, but whenever this was raised, the Assembly was immediately assured by some of the members that this question did not need to cause any embarrassment, as ample funds, if necessary, would be furnished by persons in sympathy with the movement of liberating the people of Russia. In this connection, the name of Jacob Schiff was repeatedly mentioned. End quote. Mr. Boris Brassel adds, on pages 70 and 71 of the same work, quote, "The full history of the interlocking participation of the Imperial German government and the international finance in the destruction of the Russian Empire is not yet written. It is not a mere coincidence that at the notorious meeting held in Stockholm in 1916 between the former Russian Minister of the Interior, Protopopov, and the German agents, the German Foreign Office was represented by Mr. Warburg, whose two brothers were members of the international banking firm Kuhn, Loeb and Company, of which the late Mr. Jacob Schiff was a senior member." End quote. And now to this next section, which is entitled Robert Wilton's List of the Rulers of Soviet Russia. An eyewitness of exceptional value of all the events of the Russian Revolution is Robert Wilton, the Russian correspondent of the Times for 17 years. Born in England but educated in Russia, he knew Russia like a Russian. During the war, this correspondent of the Times, on one occasion in 1916, took command of a section of the Russian army, of which the officers had been wounded, and behaved with such gallantry that he was decorated with the Cross of St. George. It was the first time that this exclusively military distinction had been conferred upon a civilian. In the foreword to his French book, Les Derniers Jours des Romanov, from which I'm about to quote, Robert Wilton says that in order to ensure the accuracy of the work, he himself translated from Russian into French the official reports and original documents confirming his narrative. Quote, "I have done all in my power," he adds, "to act as an impartial chronicler." End quote. The list of names of the rulers of Russia in 1918, which I'm about to quote, is taken from pages 136 to 137 of this painstaking French study of the Russian Bolshevik Revolution. It is a noteworthy fact that this list is not to be found in the English edition of the same work, quote, The Last Days of the Romanovs, end quote, published in September 1920 by Thornton Butterworth. According to the English Review, The Patriot of 20th February 1930, after Robert Wilton had written in 1920, quote, "The Jewish domination in Russia is supported by certain Russians. They are all mere screens or dummies behind the Sverdlovs, and the 1,001 Jews of Sovdepia continue their work of destruction," end quote. His chances in English journalism were gone. It is a well-known fact that he died in straitened circumstances in January 1925. On page 29 of Les Derniers Jours des Romanov, we read, quote, "In order not to leave myself open to any accusation of prejudice, I am giving, on pages 136 to 37, the list of the members of the Central Committee, of the Extraordinary Commission, and the Council of Commissars functioning at the time of the assassination of the imperial family. The 62 members of the committee were composed of 5 Russians, 1 Ukrainian, 6 Lets, 2 Germans, 1 Czech, 2 Armenians, 3 Georgians, 1 Karaim, which is a Jewish sect, 41 Jews. The Extraordinary Commission of Moscow was composed of 36 members, including 1 German, 1 Pole, 1 Armenian, 2 Russians, 8 Lets, 23 Jews. The Council of the People's Commissars numbered 2 Armenians, 3 Russians, 17 Jews. According to the data furnished by the Soviet press, out of 556 important functionaries of the Bolshevik state, including the above mentioned that were in the 1918 to 1919, 17 Russians, 2 Ukrainians, 11 Armenians, 35 Lets, 15 Germans, 1 Hungarian, 10 Georgians, 3 Poles, 3 Finns, 1 Czech, 1 Karen, 457 Jews. If the reader is astonished to find the Jewish hand everywhere in the affair of the assassination of the Russian imperial family, he must bear in mind the formidable numerical preponderance of Jews in the Soviet administration. End quote. On pages 136 to 138, then, of the same work, the author writes, quote, "It is in the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party that the governmental power resides. It was composed as follows in 1918. Bronstein, that was Trotsky's actual last name. Apfelbaum, whose real name was Zinoviev. Laurier, who was Laurine. Oritsky, Volodarsky, Rosenfeld, who was Kamenev. Smidovich, Sverdlov, whose real last name was Yankel. Nakhamkaz, whose real last name was Steklov." Now on to the next page. There you say it says Jews, 9. So those 9 names I quoted, the most famous, I guess you would say, would be Trotsky, of those wicked butchers. 9 of them are Jews. Now here it's saying Ulyanov, which is Vladimir Lenin, was Russian, as well as Krylenko, Lunacharsky, as Russians. However, in our times, it has been proven, and the Jews are now, proud of this, at least some are, that Lenin was actually Jewish. So I'm going to put on the screen right now this article from the Jerusalem Post, right from the horse's mouth, that he was Jewish on his mother's side, which is really how the Jews transmit their ancestry, as whether or not you're actually a Jew. It has to be from at least your mother's side. So really there on this page, it's really 10 Jews and 2 Russians. So we can see I think you're getting the point here, but it's going to develop even more. So let's continue on this page. He continues to quote from this author. "The other Russian socialist parties are similar in composition. Their central committees are made up as follows. S.D. Mensheviks, 11 members, all Jews. Communists of the People, 6 members, of whom 5 are Jews and 1 is a Russian. S.R., the right wing, 15 members, of whom 13 are Jews and 2 are Russians. Kerensky, who may be of Jewish origin, and Tchaikovsky. S.R., left wing, 12 members, of whom 10 are Jews and 2 are Russians. Committee of the Anarchists of Moscow, 5 members, of whom 4 are Jews and 1 is a Russian. Polish Communist Party, 12 members, all Jews, including Sobelson, whose last name was really Radek, Krokhenol, whose real last name was Zagonsky, and Schwartz, whose real last name was Goltz. These parties, in appearance opposed to the Bolsheviks, play the Bolsheviks' game on the sly, more or less, by preventing the Russians from pulling themselves together. Out of 61 individuals at the head of these parties, there are 6 Russians and 55 Jews. No matter what may be the name adopted, a revolutionary government will be Jewish. The Council of the People's Commissars compromises the following. And for those of you just listening on the podcast, he's listing all the ministries of the government, which I'll read them off, then the name of the person and head of that particular ministry or commissariat or commissary, however you want to term it, and then their nationality. So he starts at the top. The president, Ulyanov, which is Vladimir Lenin. And here he says his nationality is Russian. We know that he was really Jewish. Foreign Affairs, Chikarine, Russian. Nationalities, Jugachvili, Georgian. Agriculture, Protean, Armenian. Economic Council, Lorene, a Jew. Food Controller, Schlichter, Jew. Army and Navy, Bronstein, who is Trotsky, Jew. State Control, Lander, a Jew. State Lands, Kaufman, a Jew. Works, V. Schmidt, a Jew. Social Relief, E. Lalina, whose last name is really Nigison, was a Jewess. And now this continues on to page 8. Public Instruction, Launacharsky, Russian. Religions, Spitzberg, Jew. Interior, Effelbaum, whose last name was really Zinopfeif, Jew. Hygiene, Anvelt, Jew. Finance, Isidor Gufkowski, a Jew. Press, Volodarsky, a Jew. Elections, Oritsky, Jew. Justice, I. Steinberg, Jew. Refugees, Fenigstein, a Jew. The assistant to the refugees, Savich, a Jew, and the other assistant to the refugees, Zaslavsky, also a Jew. Out of 22 members, 3 Russians, 1 Georgian, 1 Armenian, 17 Jews. The following is the list of members of the Central Executive Committee. Sverdlov, who was president, a Jew. Avensov, who was the secretary, Armenian. Bruno, Let. Breslau, Let. Babachinsky, Jew. Bukharin, Russian. Weinberg, Jew. Galis, Jew. Gansberg, Jew. Denichevsky, Jew. Stark, German. Sachs, Jew. Scheinmann, Jew. Erdling, Jew. Landauer, Jew. Now on to page 9, and this list continues. Linder, Jew. Woloch, Czech. Dziminanstein, Jew. Enkudits, Georgian. Erman, Jew. Jaffa, Jew. Karklein, Jew. Nigslin, Jew. Rosenfeld, whose real last name was Kamenev, Jew. Apfelbaum, whose last name was Zinoviev, Jew. Kirilenko, Russian. Krasikov, Jew. Kaprik, Jew. Kau, Let. Ulyanov, Vladimir Lenin. It says on the page Russian. We know he really was a Jew. Latsis, Jew. Lader, Jew. Launacharsky, Russian. Peterson, Let. Peters, Let. Rudzautas, Jew. Rosine, Jew. Smitovich, Jew. Stouchka, Let. Nakhomkes, whose last name was Steklov, Jew. Snazovsky, Jew. Skritnik, Jew. Bronstein, who is the infamous Trotsky, Jew. Teodorovich, Jew. Terian, Armenian. Oritsky, Jew. Telekin, Russian. Feldman, Jew. Okay, now on to page 10, where the list continues. Frumkine, Jew. Suryupa, Ukrainian. Chevedez, Georgian. Sheikhman, Jew. Rosenthal, Jew. Ashkenazi, Imeretzian, which I'm assuming that's probably a Jewish cult, like this next one, Karakine, which was Quran, which Father Fahey explained before was a Jewish sect. Rose, Jew. Sobelson, whose last name was Radek, a Jew. Schlichter, Jew. Shiklonini, Jew. Chiklonsky, Jew. Levine, whose real last name was Pravdin, Jew. Accordingly, out of 61 members, 5 are Russians, 6 are Lets, 1 is a German, 2 are Armenians, 1 is a Czech, 1 is an Emiratian, 2 are Georgians, 1 is a Karam, 1 is a Ukrainian, and 41 are Jews. The following is the list of the members of the Extraordinary Commission of Moscow. Dzerzhinsky, President, Pole. Peters, Vice President, Let. Chavlovsky, Jew. Heifs, Jew. Zistein, Jew. Razmirovich, Jew. Kronberg, Jew. Kaikina, Jewess. Carlson, Let. Schaumann, Let. Leontovich, Jew. Jacob Goldine, Jew. The list continues on page 11. Galperstein, Jew. Nigason, Jew. Latzitz, Let. Schleinkos, Jew. Jansen, Let. Rivkine, Jew. Antonov, Russian. Delafabre, Jew. Titskine, Jew. Roskarovich, Jew. G. Sverdlov, Jew. Beinsinski, Jew. Blumkine, Jew. Alexandrovich, Russian. I. Model, Jew. Rautenberg, Jew. Pines, Jew. Sachs, Jew. Daybol, Let. Saswan, Armenian. Deliklin, Let. Liebert, Jew. Vogel, German. Zakis, Let. In all, 36 members, of whom 1 is a Pole, 1 a German, 1 an Armenian, 2 are Russians, 8 are Lets, and 23 are Jews. Accordingly, there is no reason for being surprised at the preponderating role of the Jews in the assassination of the imperial family. It is rather the opposite which would have been surprising. And in modern days, some of the members of the Russian Orthodox Church believe, and they have good evidence of this, that the assassination of the imperial royal family, the Orthodox Christian Romanovs, was in fact a Jewish ritual murder. And I do have a couple of videos on that subject on my channel. So certainly if this interests you, you're going to want to listen to all of that, because it is very fascinating. And indeed, these are dark forces. These are diabolic forces, satanic forces at work here. That's what is behind the Talmud, behind the Kabbalah. As Christ said to the Jews, you are of your father the devil. And when then in the book of Revelation, he said a couple of times, they say they are Jews, but they are not. They are the synagogue of Satan. And this is just further proving that point. And I would submit, and this is just my own personal speculation, so for what it's worth, this is one of the key reasons why Our Lady of Fatima came to warn the world. Remember, she came in 1917 when all of this was brewing and the Russian Revolution was beginning. But the consecration of Russia specifically to her Immaculate Heart, I mean, I really see that as an exorcism when you tie in the high likelihood. I believe it was a ritual murder. I really have no doubt that it was, because these are satanic forces, like I was just saying. But the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary by a valid Catholic Pope, in union with the bishops of the world, however few there might be left that are actually Catholic, is what would cast out those demonic spirits and convert that nation. And that's why I believe Our Lady is asking for that, because of the ritual magic, the satanic power that has come upon that nation. And as we are living now, Russia's errors have spread across the entire world. They've landed here on the shores of the United States. They've been here for a very long time, and they are unveiling themselves more and more each day. The fangs of Dracula are coming out in full effect. And just one more thing I want to comment on regarding the consecration of Russia. Pope Pius XII did actually consecrate the people of Russia to the Immaculate Heart. Yes, he did make a consecration of the world, but he did later on July 7th, 1952. You can read it on the Vatican website. In his apostolic letter Sacro Vergente, he specifically named the Russian people, consecrated them specifically to the Immaculate Heart. So a true Catholic Pope did make the consecration. It wasn't with the bishops of the world, but it was done. So what we're waiting for is a true Catholic Pope in union with whatever bishops are left in the world that are truly Catholic to do the consecration, which Bergoglio is unable to do because, in my opinion, he is not even a Christian, not a validly ordained priest, not a validly consecrated bishop, because all of his quote-unquote orders were done in the new rites, which are illicit, condemned by Session 7, Canon 13 of the Council of Trent, and invalid because they're completely changed from the Catholic understanding of it. Francis Bergoglio doesn't even believe in the Catholic papacy. So how can he possibly consecrate anything as a Catholic Pope if he has neither the faith nor believes in the papacy as the Catholic Church has always taught it? So anyway, let's get back to the book and to the next page. According to the erudite Russian writer Petrovsky, in La Russie sous les Juifs, page 79, quote, Nicholas II, the imperial family, and the faithful members of his suite were shot by the Jew Urowsky, assisted by the Jews Golochukhin and Voykov, in obedience to the order sent from Moscow by the Jew Sverdlov, and with the approval of the Council of the People's Commissars. End quote. We have seen the composition of the council. Now the next section, which is entitled Pope Pius XI and the Preparation of the Russian Revolution. Pope Pius XI wrote as follows in the encyclical letter Divini Redemptoris, quote, For them, the peoples of the Soviet Union, we cherish the warmest paternal affection. We are well aware that not a few of them groan beneath the yoke imposed on them by men who in very large part are strangers to the real interests of the country. We recognize that many others were deceived by fallacious hopes. We blame only the system with its authors and abettors who considered Russia the best field for experimenting with a plan elaborated years ago, and who from there continued to spread it from one end of the world to the other. End quote. In this pamphlet, I have outlined some of the historical evidence which goes to prove that those, quote, strangers to the real interests of Russia, end quote, who are experimenting with this Marxian plan elaborated years ago, are members of the Jewish nation, and that communism is the latest and, up to the present, the most decadent materialistic phase of the opposition of that nation to the supernatural Messiah. The next section is entitled Some Points of Detail. Since the first publication of this pamphlet, doubts have been expressed about the accuracy of some details contained therein, especially about the language in Lenin's home about the Jewish nationality of Madame Kollontai, Piatakov, and Karakane. I have dealt with the question of Lenin's nationality at some length in this edition, on pages 25 to 27, without, however, pretending to be able to settle the question definitively. Madame Kollontai is spoken of as a Jewess, and Piatakov and Karakine are given as Jews in the document quoted from the quote-unquote defender of Kansas for period 1935 to 1936. I have since discovered that this list is probably taken from a pamphlet in French, Les Us and URSS, published by Les Nouvelles Editions Nationales of Paris. The list of names in the French pamphlet are quoted from another pamphlet in Russian with the same title, and they are preceded by an introduction from the pen of a former secretary of a communist quote-unquote cell. In spite of these guarantees of special knowledge, it is almost certain that Madame Kollontai is not a Jewess, but a Russian. There was a Russian revolutionary named Piatakov, but I have not been able to discover if he is identical with the Piatakov mentioned as a Jew in the quote-unquote Defender and in the French pamphlet. I have been also assured that Karkahin is an Armenian, not a Jew. In Robert Wilton's list, quoted in the foreword, there is a Karkahin who is a Karem, which means that he is a member of the Jewish sect of the Karaites. That may account for the conflicting statements about him. The doubts raised about these points of detail only serve to confirm the overwhelming truth of what Robert Wilton wrote in The Last Days of the Romanovs. Quote, "The Jewish domination in Russia is supported by certain Russians. They, the Jews, having wrecked and plundered Russia by appealing to the ignorance of the working folk, are now using their dupes to set up a new tyranny worse than any the world has known." End quote. That tyranny is kept in existence by the same means by which it was set up. Quote, in Red Dusk and the Morrow, end quote, page 303, by Sir Paul Dukes, formerly chief of the British Secret Service in Russia. We read that a Lithuanian asked a prominent Bolshevik how the regime was maintained. The answer was, quote, "Our power is based on three things. First, on Jewish brains. Secondly, on Lettish and Chinese bayonets. And thirdly, on the crass stupidity of the Russian people." End quote. One must deprecate the horrible insult to the unfortunate Russians whose natural leaders have been murdered, but the statement may otherwise be taken as a fairly accurate summary of the situation. And just as an aside, some of you may be familiar with Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He exposes this in many of his works. He did win a Nobel Prize. I would like to do some of his... He did do a work on the Jews and Russia, so I may work on that at some point. But for those of you who maybe are not familiar with him, certainly someone to check out his works, because he was very outspoken about what was going on in Russia and who was behind it. So now let's continue into the next section, which is entitled The War, September 1939 to question mark. So obviously this book was written in 1939, and they did not know how long the war would last. And it continues on. This little book and the previous portion of this foreword have been written before the war began between England, France, Poland on the one side, and Germany on the other. For years, anyone accustomed to JudeoMasonic methods could easily see that the quote-unquote democracies of England, France, and the United States were being urged on to war against quote-unquote fascism. That was and is quite clear and certain. On the other hand, the world program of the rulers of Russia involves the unceasing effort to get the capitalist countries into armed conflict. A statement made by Stalin at a session of the Third International, or Comintern in Moscow, in May 1938, makes this manifest. Quote, "The revival of revolutionary action on any scale sufficiently vast," end quote, said the Muscovite figurehead, quote, "will not be possible unless we succeed in utilizing the existing disagreements between the capitalistic countries so as to precipitate them against each other into armed conflict. The doctrine of Marx, Engels, Lenin teaches us that all war truly generalized should terminate automatically by revolution. The essential work of our party comrades in foreign countries consists, then, in facilitating the provocation of such a conflict. Those who do not comprehend this know nothing of revolutionary Marxism. I hope that you will remind the comrades, those of you who direct the work. The decisive hour will arrive." End quote. That was quoted from The Patriot, May 25th, 1939. The Pravda of 7th November 1938 contains a statement issued by Dimitrov, General Secretary of the Comintern, in which he says, amongst other things, quote, "We must prevent a criminal understanding between the fascist aggressors and the British and French imperialist clique," end quote. And that was part of the footnote. When the quote-unquote democracies have been sufficiently keyed up by all the means at the disposal of financial forces, a non-aggression pact signed by Stalin gave Germany hope of sufficient supplies to be able to withstand the blockade. Stalin had thus done his part to promote conflict, and can now watch the growth of exhaustion in the different countries, while awaiting the decisive hour for world revolution. The attack on the mass may even be begun by a repetition of the dismemberment of Poland. Long ago, Frederick the Great of Prussia invited Russia and Austria to a quote-unquote mystic communion in the body of Poland, end quote, saying that it might not be good for the good of their souls, but that it would be good for the good of their states. History repeats itself. There are rumors of an anti-Jewish drive in Moscow. Some even go so far as to say that the death or deportation or imprisonment by Stalin of many of the Jews who, since the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917, have controlled the world activity of Moscow, is indicative of a Russian national anti-Semitic reaction. This reasoning is very superficial. In spite of the quote-unquote purges, Jewish enthusiasm for communism, as seen, for example, in regard to Spain, has not diminished in the least, nor has there been that slacking off in the activity of communist agents, which inevitably follows quarrels in the central authority. In passing, it is worth recalling that many of those quote-unquote liquidated Jews were originally introduced into Russia by Jewish financiers acting in collaboration with the German government. So far as one can see at present, there may be some superficial reactions in Russia as a result of the German-Soviet pact, but the fundamental orientation of Russia has not varied. The program of world revolution, as outlined by Stalin in 1938, still holds. If Jewish propaganda for communism lessens in volume and intensity, not merely in passing but in permanent fashion, and if the activity of communist agents grows less, then we may look for the existence of some kind of national reaction in Russia. If not, then all that will have happened is that some of the figureheads will have changed, while the secret controlling authority remains the same. And just to read from that footnote number 2 in this page, it says, "It is curious to find Die Zeit, a Yiddish daily of London, in substantial agreement with this, in its issue of September 17th, 1939. In the early days of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, there was a resistance to the new orientation on the part of some Jews in Russia, but it quickly died away. In this connection, it is interesting to note the announcement that the Jew, Karl Radek, his last name really is Sobelson, though under guard since the Zinoviev trial, has been named head of the Soviet Russian Atheist Party. He is one of the ablest of the older revolutionaries. The reasoning outlined in the last paragraph is confirmed by the perusal of a remarkable book, excellently documented, entitled, quote, "The Russian Farce of Germany," end quote, which appeared in 1932 from the pen of Mr. Cecil F. Melville. Mr. Melville gives in detail the history of the collaboration between the German army authorities and Soviet Russia. I will quote some extracts and allow them to speak for themselves. Quote, "The story I shall unfold in these pages is the story of Germany's two faces. The one towards Western Europe, the other turned towards Soviet Russia. It can be said, without any exaggeration, that from 1921 till the present day Russia has been able, thanks to Germany, to equip herself with all kinds of arms, munitions, and the most up-to-date war material for an army of several millions, and that, thanks to her factories manufacturing war material in Russia, Germany has been able to assure herself not only of secret supplies of war material and the training of officers and other ranks in the use of this material, but also, in the event of war, the possession of the best-stocked arsenals in Russia. The firm of Krupps of Essen, Krupp the German, Cannon King, in German Kannenkönig, deserves a chapter to itself in this review of German war industries in Russia. It deserves a separate chapter because its activity upon Soviet territory has grown to tremendous proportions. The final consolidation of the dominating position Krupps occupy in Russia was the formation of a separate company, Maniak, to which the Soviet government granted a liberal concession. Negotiations concerning these concessions for the company were conducted in Moscow for several months. Gradually, there was formed in Russia a chain of experimental training camps and artillery parks, ostensibly eliminated by the Treaty of Versailles. These are under the management of German officers, and they are invariably teeming with Germans, either arriving to undergo a course of training or leaving after the completion of the course. At the time of writing, 1932, interest is growing in the rising star of Herr Adolf Hitler, the Nazi leader. Herr Hitler is regarded as the protagonist par excellence of the right against the left in Germany, and, as a Hitlerist regime is anticipated before long, it may perhaps be argued that the Dritte Reich of the Nazis, the sworn enemies of communism, would not tolerate the Reichswehr Red Army connection. Such a conclusion would be inaccurate to the last degree. Stalin, the realist, would have no qualms in collaborating with a Hitlerist Germany. But more important than this are the following facts. The Reichswehr chiefs and their political allies amongst the civilian politicians and officials have succeeded in nursing their Eastern orientation, their underground military collaboration with the Soviets, in spite of all the changes of political regime in Germany since the end of the war. It has made little or no difference to them whether the Reich government has been composed of men of the right, the center, or the left. They have just continued their policy uninfluenced by political change. There is no reason to suppose that they would change their course under a Hitlerist regime, especially when it is remembered that most of the aims in external policy of the Nazi leaders are identical with those of the nationalists and the military leaders themselves. Furthermore, there are the great German industrialists of nationalist color who are amongst the principal collaborators on the war material side with the Reichswehr chiefs, and who are, therefore, hand in glove with the directors of the Abmachungen agreements plot. Many of these great industrialists are contributors on a big scale to the Nazi Party funds. A Hitlerist Germany would, therefore, have no qualms in continuing the collaboration with Soviet Russia. The Reichswehr chiefs who are conducting the Abmachungen delude themselves that they can use Bolshevist Russia to help them in their hoped-for war of revenge against Europe, and then, in the hour of victory, hold the Bolshevists at bay and keep them in their place. The more subtle psychologists at the Kremlin, of course, know better, but are wise enough to keep their knowledge to themselves. The fact, however, that this Russian-German plot will, in the end, bring about the destruction of Germany will not in any way reconcile Europe to its own destruction at the hands of Germany and Russia together." End quote. In spite, then, of Russia's design to bring about world revolution, Prussia wants to make use of Russia to secure, quote, "the place in the sun," end quote, to which she thinks she is entitled. As far back as 1931, General von Seeckt, the creator of the new German army, the Reichswehr, set out the Prussian program in a speech delivered on January 24, 1931, before the Economic Society of Munster in Westphalia. He said, quote, "The goal of Russia is in the first instance a world revolution. The nucleus of opposition to such plans is to be found in the capitalist powers, England and France in the first instance, with America close behind them. There follows a certain community of interests of Russia with Germany, which is being threatened by the demands of these powers. The most profound animosity of Russia is directed against Poland, the ally of the world powers, and Russia's immediate neighbor. Herein lies the point of Russia's closest rapprochement with Germany. The fact that the Western powers, by helping Russia expose themselves to a great danger, is too obvious to require further proofs. As far as we are concerned, this danger exists considerably nearer, but nevertheless our position between France and Poland compels us to try to remain in constant touch and in close understanding with Russia in order not to fall into complete dependence upon the Western countries. This position will remain compulsory for us no matter whether the present regime in Russia continues or not." With regard to Poland, General von Seeckt added that any understanding between Germany and Poland was out of the question. He held that German hopes for the future were intimately bound up with her relations with Russia, but that Germany should ruthlessly repulse any attempt at penetration on the part of Bolshevism. It is quite clear now that the Prussians in 1939, as in 1932 and before it, are to be reckoned amongst those who think, as Mr. Melville puts it, that they can play with the devil and win. Russia's aims, or rather the aims of those who control Russia, have not changed. Trotsky, on the one hand, wanted world revolution as the only secure bulwark for a strong communist state in Russia. Stalin, on the other hand, wanted a strong Soviet-Russian state as the only secure foundation for world revolution. Stalin's point of view has been accepted by the controlling powers, and we have been allowed by the Russian Board of Censors, whose non-Russian nationality was certified to us by Mr. Douglas Reed in 1935, to peruse what they thought fit about the very elaborate elimination of the elements imbued with the Trotskyist ideals. Both Stalin and Trotsky, however, were and are instruments of those for whom communism is a means. We must therefore bear well in mind that the, quote, new Bolshevist orthodoxy of Stalin is probably more dangerous to Europe in the long run than the more spectacular methods of Trotsky and the more vocal methods of Zinoviev in the heyday of the Third International. I say more dangerous and more formidable because a more practical conception than the old Trotskyite idea. It is just the growth of this Stalinist conception which has made possible the continuance of an ever-increasing scale of the secret relationship between Red Russia and White Germany. Molotov's speech on the Russo-German Pact at the beginning of September 1939 has served as a partial foundation for the rumors of a quote-unquote Russian national reaction. Molotov, the Soviet Minister for Foreign Affairs, is reported to have said, when speaking of the Russo-German Pact before the Soviet Supreme Council, quote, "People ask how the Soviet Union could consent to improve political relations with a state of the fascist type, such as Germany. But they forget that we hold the position of not interfering in the internal affairs of other countries." End quote. Some have concluded from this that Hitler has induced the Russian government to renounce Jewish international communism and restrict its socialistic ideology to Russia. They forget, however, that Molotov is surely a loyal follower of Marx and Lenin. He doubtlessly follows Lenin's instructions. Quote, "We deny all morality in the bourgeois sense," end quote, wrote Lenin. For according to the bourgeois, morality has its origins in the commandments of God. Our morality, on the contrary, is entirely subordinate to the interests of the proletariat." End quote. Accordingly, a lie is not a lie when it serves the interests of the proletariat. Lenin admitted that he had accepted German money to make the Bolshevik Revolution, but he added, quote, "I will make the same revolution in Germany with Russian money." End quote. Has Lenin's program been scrapped? Again, if the Soviet has given up interfering in the internal affairs of other countries, why has Lazovsky, a Jew whose real name is Solomon Abramovich Dridzo, been named permanent head of the Soviet Foreign Office and principal advisor to Molotov? According to the tablet of July 15, 1939, Lazovsky is par excellence the apostle of revolution through war. Quote, "The truth then is," quote, concludes the leader writer in the tablet just quoted, "that the Russian Comintern is still confessedly engaged in endeavoring to foment war in order to facilitate revolution, and that one of its chief organizers, Lazovsky, has been installed as principal advisor to Molotov." A few months ago, he wrote in the French publication La Vieille Ouvrière that his chief aim in life is the overthrow of the existing order in the great democracies. End quote. And just as an aside, that overthrow of the existing order, that's just another term for the New World Order. So continuing on here on page 19, anyone who had read Mr. Melville's able study was not astonished at the ease with which the German Nazis did business with the Jewish officials of the Soviet. The tradition had long been forming. No wonder the German bishops felt compelled to say in a joint pastoral letter of 1935 that even the most anti-Bolshevist circles, in spite of their protestations, were being infected with a spiritual communism. In his letter of 2nd February 1930 on the Soviet campaign against God, Pope Pius XI wrote as follows, quote, "We were also at pains to ask the governments represented at the Conference of Genoa to make, by common agreement, a declaration which might have saved Russia and all the world from many woes, demanding as a condition preliminary to any recognition of the Soviet government, respect for conscience, freedom of worship, and of church property. Alas, these 3 points, so essential above all to those ecclesiastical hierarchies unhappily separated from Catholic unity, were abandoned in favor of temporal interests, which in fact would have been better safeguarded if the different governments had first of all considered the rights of God, his kingdom, and his justice." End quote. The governments of Europe refused concerted action for the rights of God. Now that war has broken out in Europe, Russia will make every effort to pursue her campaign against God. In the splendid encyclical letter on the condition of the Church in Germany, March 14, 1937, Pope Pius XI said that, quote, "The first and obvious duty the priest owes to the world about him is service to the truth, the whole truth, the unmasking and refutation of error in whatever form or disguise it conceals itself." End quote. During the terrible conflict that is now raging in Europe, one of the greatest services that can be rendered to the cause of truth is to warn the world of the ulterior revolutionary designs of the rulers of Russia. They aim everywhere, as in Spain, at the elimination of the love of our Lord. Their efforts in Spain have terminated in a glorious victory for Christ, and today, the feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross, the crucifix is being solemnly reinstated in the schools of Madrid and of the provinces from which it had been banished. Quote, "Spain's victory has mainly been a victory of the cross, and our war was fought as a crusade against the enemies of truth." End quote. So runs the decree of the Spanish Minister of Education ordaining this act of reparation. May the example of Spanish Catholicism nerve Catholics for the coming struggle everywhere. There are ominous signs of preparations on the part of international financiers under cover of the war for a naturalistic organization of the United States of Europe and of the world. It will be a new and revised edition of that JudeoMasonic creation, the League of Nations. The Bank for International Settlements will develop its power still further. And just to hold up here for a second before I go on to the last part of this section, on page 20, we just saw he's talked about a United States of Europe. So remember, this was back in 1938. They were already discussing the EU, which would become the European Union. And we see that as the new European Soviet, where it is controlled by councils, by Soviets. And it is JudeoMasonic. It is looking to destroy the last vestiges of Christendom through mass migration of non-Christian people from Africa and from the Middle East, to destroy those countries, destroy those cultures, and to bring in revolution. He mentions the League of Nations, which would later become the United Nations, which is a communist organization. The Rockefellers were behind that, and the Bank of International Settlements, and we're seeing all of this now come to reality. And this is the so-called Great Reset, the New World Order, Marxist globalism, the World Revolution. We are in it. We are in it to such an extent right now that it is unbelievably frightening because of the technology and the power these people have. So I just wanted to make that comment, and now let's just get on to the final part here of the postscript, which is the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, dated September 14th, 1939. And Father Fahey says, just when correcting the final proofs of this book, the Patriot, London, of 9th November 1939 came to hand. It contains the following, quote, there is, however, no real evidence that the Soviet government has changed its policy of communism under control of the Bolsheviks, or has loosened its control of communism in other countries, or has ceased to be under Jew control. Unwanted tools certainly have been, quote-unquote, liquidated in Russia by Stalin in his determination to be the supreme head, and it is not unnatural that some Jews, when all the leading positions were held by them, have suffered in the process of rival elimination. Outside Russia, events in Poland show how the Comintern still works. The Polish Ukraine has been communized under Jewish commissars, with property owners either shot or marched into Russia as slaves, with all estates confiscated and all business and property taken over by the state. It has been said in the American Jewish press that the Bolshevik advance into the Ukraine was to save the Jews there from meeting the fate of their co-religionists in Germany. But this same press is silent as to the fate meted out to the Christian Poles. In less than a month, in any case, the lie has been given to Molotov's non-interference statement. Should international communism ever complete its plan of bringing civilization to naught, it is conceivable that some form of world government in the hands of a few men could emerge, which would not be communism. It would be the domination of barbarous tyrants over a world of slaves, and communism would have been used as the means to an end. End quote. And that is just unbelievable, frightening, because we're at that point where we are getting to that world domination of barbarous tyrants. They want to depopulate the world. They want a godless world. They want this transhumanism. It's truly diabolic and satanic from the pit of hell. And the synagogue of Satan is certainly well behind it, as we would expect, as they look for their Messiah, the Antichrist, to come to reveal himself, to come to power. And let us not forget that there were 10 or so million Ukrainian Orthodox Christians that were starved to death in the Holodomor by the predominantly Jewish Bolsheviks. And this is in the 1930s, like I mentioned earlier, well before the so-called event that happened during World War II, that I'm not even going to mention here. But you never hear anything about that mass murder because of who it was committed by. So I'm going to end this section and this video here. I think we've gone on long enough. And that's just the forward. So I will see you next time. It might be sometime next week. It might be in 2 weeks. It depends on how much time I have to do this next section. But you might want to listen to this a couple of times anyway, because there's so much information, so much historic information here. And for us to be able to look back at this, and especially what's going on in the Ukraine right now, as history in many ways repeats itself. And I just want to bring one last thing to your attention. On the screen right now, you're going to see an article from the liberal Washington Post. You can see it says widespread admiration for Volodymyr Zelensky could upend stereotypes about Jewish men. It's really kind of a pathetic article trying to promote this guy. He's just an actor and a comedian, just a puppet on the stage who was, put in by Soros and NATO and the JudeoMasonic Western powers. But here you have the leader of the Ukraine, which is not a Jewish country. The ethnic groups are mainly Christian, Orthodox Christian. But here you have Jews, which make up 0.2% of the whole population, and he leads the country. So anyway, that's it for now. Please keep in your prayers. Remember to hit the like and subscribe button, and may God have mercy on us all.